These are some notes for the absolute value lessons that you're doing. So this is an introduction to absolute value. So we have two definitions that we can use with absolute value. Definition 1 is that absolute value of A means the distance from 0 to A on the number line. Now we're going to look at a couple examples. In each of these examples, we're asking ourselves, what does the given absolute value mean? So example 1, absolute value of 4. And absolute value of 4 means the distance from 0 to 4, which is 4. So the absolute value of 4 equals 4. Example 2, absolute value of negative 1.4 means the distance from 0 to negative 1.4. And the distance, remember distance is always positive. You would never say go negative 4 feet. You would say go negative 4 feet in a particular direction, but you would never say negative 4 feet. So it's a distance of 1.4. Absolute value of x equals 10 means x is a distance of 10 from 0. So if I'm looking at a number line and I start at 0 and I go 10 this way and 10 this way, I end up at positive 10 and negative 10. So x equals negative 10 or positive 10. Last example for this definition, if I have the absolute value of x equals negative 6, that means x is a distance of negative 6 from 0. However, like we said before, we never talk about distances being negative, and so this means that x does not equal anything in this case. Definition 2. In this definition, we say that the absolute value of A equals A if A is greater than or equal to 0. And the absolute value of A equals negative A if A is less than 0. I'll put curly cues so we understand that that's a full definition. So now we have some examples. Example, and the directions will be to simplify. Example 1, the absolute value of 4. Since 4 is greater than or equal to 0, the absolute value of 4 equals 4. Example 2, absolute value of negative 1.4. Since negative 1.4 is less than 0, the absolute value of negative 1.4 is the negative of negative 1.4, which is positive 1.4. Example 3. absolute value of x equals 10. So in this case, we have to actually talk about the two cases. So if x is greater than or equal to 0, then x is positive, and that equals 10. If x is less than 0, that means x is negative, and that equals 10. And now I have to clean up my work a little bit, because in this problem I don't want to solve for negative x, I want to solve for x. So I am going to divide both sides by -1, which gives me x equals -10. So my final answer is x equals 10 or -10. Our last example is just to show that before I can have this conversation about what x can be, I need to have my absolute value alone. So right here in this problem, I'm going to need to add 10 to both sides before I can do anything else. So now I have the absolute value of x equals 16. So then I have that same conversation. If x is greater than or equal to 0, then I have x equals 16. If x is less than 0, that means it's actually negative of x, and that equals 16. But of course, I'm not solving for negative x, I'm solving for positive x, so I divide both sides by -1. So my final answer is x equals positive 16 or negative 16.